It was a crisp autumn morning in the quiet town of Ridgewood, a place where the hum of small-town life often masked the underlying tensions that simmered beneath the surface. Derek Miles, a soft-spoken man in his mid-40s, adjusted his tie in the reflection of the coffee shop window. He wasn't dressed for his usual role as a community organizer today. Instead, he was preparing for an important meeting with the mayor, a meeting that could change everything, though no one else knew it yet. The streets buzzed with the usual morning rush. Commuters hurried to their destinations, coffee cups in hand, while schoolchildren skipped along the sidewalks, their laughter adding life to the brisk air. Derek stood at the corner of Elm and Main, scrolling through his phone to check his emails. He had no idea that this ordinary moment would soon become the catalyst for an extraordinary chain of events. At the same time, Officer Jacob Hart cruised down Main Street in his patrol car. Known for his sharp uniform and brusque demeanor, Hart had been with the Ridgewood Police Department for over a decade. To some, he was a symbol of authority and order; to others, especially members of the town's Black and Latino communities, he was a figure of quiet dread. Hart prided himself on maintaining control, but his interpretation of the word often crossed lines. As Derek stepped off the curb to cross the street, he glanced at his phone, distracted by an email notification. Hart noticed immediately and hit the brakes, his car screeching to a halt. The sound startled everyone nearby. Derek looked up, realizing he had inadvertently crossed at an unmarked section of the street. It was a minor mistake, one that most officers might let slide with a simple warning. But not Hart. The officer threw open his door and stepped out, his boots echoing against the pavement. "Hey! You think the rules don't apply to you?" he barked, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of passers-by. Derek raised his hands in a gesture of apology. "I'm sorry, officer. It was my mistake. I didn't see the crosswalk." Hart wasn't satisfied. He approached Derek, his chest puffed out, and jabbed a finger toward him. "Sorry doesn't cut it. You people always think you can get away with whatever you want." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. A small crowd began to gather, their curiosity piqued by the commotion. Some reached for their phones, recording discreetly. Derek's expression remained calm, but inside, he felt a familiar sting, a mix of frustration and humiliation that came with being singled out in public. "Look, officer, I don't want any trouble," Derek said evenly, trying to de-escalate the situation. But Hart wasn't done. He leaned in closer, his voice dripping with contempt. "Trouble finds you when you don't follow the rules." And then, in an act so brazen it stunned even him, Hart spat at Derek's feet. The crowd gasped audibly, the sound breaking the tension like a crack of thunder. Time seemed to freeze. Derek looked down at the wet spot on the pavement, his jaw tightening. He took a deep breath, his composure unshaken, though the anger burned hot inside him. Hart sneered, clearly satisfied with his display of dominance. He turned to walk back to his patrol car, but before he could reach it, a woman in the crowd called out, "I got it all on video." Others murmured in agreement, their phones still trained on him. For a moment, Hart hesitated, realizing the gravity of what he'd just done. But instead of apologizing or retreating, he doubled down. "Mind your business," he snapped at the onlookers before slamming his car door and driving off. Derek stood still for a moment, the weight of what had just happened settling over him. He glanced at the crowd, offering a small nod to those who had recorded the incident. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. As the crowd dispersed, Derek turned and walked toward City Hall, his thoughts racing. This was no ordinary morning anymore. The world as he knew it had shifted, and though he didn't yet realize the full scope of what was to come, he knew one thing for sure: change was coming, whether the town of Ridgewood was ready for it or not. Unbeknownst to Officer Hart, the man he had just disrespected so blatantly was on his way to a meeting that would solidify his appointment as Ridgewood's next chief of police. The irony of the situation was almost poetic, and Derek couldn't help but wonder how Hart would react when he found out. For now, though, Derek's focus was clear. He had a role to step into and a community to lead, not just in the face of adversity, but toward a better, fairer future. As he reached the steps of City Hall, Derek paused and looked back at the street where the encounter had taken place. The crowd was gone, the street once again quiet. But the ripples of that moment were just beginning to spread, and Derek knew they would soon grow into waves that could reshape Ridgewood forever. Derek Miles climbed the steps of City Hall with a slow, deliberate pace, his thoughts swirling like a storm. The confrontation with Officer Hart had left a bitter taste in his mouth, but Derek was no stranger to moments like these. Growing up in Ridgewood, he'd experienced the sting of prejudice more times than he could count. Yet, this moment felt different. It wasn't just about him, it was about something bigger, about a community at its breaking point and a system that had allowed people like Hart to thrive unchecked. Inside City Hall, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the chaos on the street. The marble floors gleamed under the morning sun, and the faint hum of conversations echoed through the grand atrium. Derek headed straight for the mayor's office, his appointment looming. He paused briefly outside the heavy oak door, exhaled deeply, and knocked. "Come in," came the mayor's voice, firm but welcoming. Mayor Linda Torres was a sharp, pragmatic leader with a reputation for getting things done. She had been instrumental in pushing for reforms in Ridgewood, though the road had been anything but easy. As Derek entered the room, she stood and extended her hand with a warm smile. "Derek, it's good to see you," she said. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." "Of course, Mayor Torres," he replied, shaking her hand firmly. "I appreciate the opportunity." She gestured for him to sit, and as he did, she leaned forward, her expression turning serious. "Derek, I'll get straight to the point. The council and I have decided to appoint you as the new chief of police. We've reviewed your track record, your leadership within the community, and your vision for change. You're exactly what this department, and this town, needs right now." Derek nodded, though the weight of her words pressed heavily on him. He'd been preparing for this moment for months, but now that it was here, it felt surreal. "I'm honored," he said, his voice steady. "And I'm ready to take on this responsibility. But I have to be honest, Mayor Torres. The department is going to resist this. Change won't come easy." The mayor sighed, her eyes clouding with concern. "You're right. There's a culture within the department that's deeply ingrained, and it's not going to shift overnight. But I believe in you, Derek. You've earned the respect of this community, and I think you can earn the respect of the force, too. It's going to take time, but I know you're the person to lead this charge." As they discussed the logistics of the announcement and the challenges ahead, Derek couldn't help but replay the morning's encounter with Officer Hart in his mind. The audacity, the disrespect, it wasn't just a reflection of one man's ignorance. It was a symptom of a larger disease, one that had festered in Ridgewood for far too long. Their meeting concluded, and the mayor stood to shake Derek's hand once more. "We'll make the announcement this afternoon," she said. "Be ready. This town is going to be watching." Derek nodded, his mind already racing with plans. As he left City Hall, he noticed a small group of reporters gathered outside, their cameras trained on the building's entrance. News traveled fast in Ridgewood, and it was clear that rumors of a new chief were already swirling. Derek kept his head high and walked past them, offering no comment. He knew his time to speak would come soon enough. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Officer Hart was oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He sat in the break room with a smug grin, recounting the morning's events to a couple of his colleagues. "Can you believe that guy?" he said, shaking his head. "Thinks he can just stroll across the street like he owns the place. People like him have no respect for the law." One of the officers chuckled uncomfortably, clearly unsure how to respond. The other shifted awkwardly, mumbling something about needing to finish his report. Hart's reputation as a hothead was well known, and while some of his colleagues admired his no-nonsense approach, others saw him as a liability. As the day went on, whispers about the new police chief began to circulate through the precinct. Hart overheard snippets of conversation but paid them little mind. To him, the idea of someone new coming in didn't seem like a big deal, until one of the sergeants pulled him aside. "Hey, Hart," the sergeant said, his tone low. "You might want to keep your head down for a while. Word is, the new chief's been picked, and it's someone from the community." Hart frowned, his bravado faltering slightly. "From the community? What's that supposed to mean?" The sergeant hesitated, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Let's just say they're not going to take kindly to the way you handle things." He wanted their input, their support, and their voices at the table. If he was going to succeed, he knew it would take more than just policies, it would take people coming together. Meanwhile, the video of Officer Hart's confrontation with Derek continued to spread online. What had started as a local incident was now gaining traction nationally, with hashtags like #RidgewoodJustice and #NewChief trending. The footage was damning, showing Hart's blatant disrespect and Derek's calm restraint. As the video circulated, so did calls for Hart's suspension or termination. By the time Derek arrived at the precinct the next morning, the atmosphere was tense. He was greeted by the department's senior staff, who gave him polite but cautious smiles. Hart was conspicuously absent, having called in sick, a decision that drew knowing looks from his colleagues. Derek didn't waste time with pleasantries. He called a department-wide meeting and addressed the officers directly. Standing at the front of the room, he met their gazes one by one, his expression firm but approachable. "I want to start by saying that I respect the work you all do," he began. "Policing is one of the most difficult and important jobs in any community. But respect is a two-way street, and it's time we hold ourselves to the standards this community deserves. Change is coming, and it's not going to be easy. But it's necessary." The room was silent, the tension palpable. Some officers nodded in agreement, while others crossed their arms or avoided eye contact altogether. Derek continued, outlining his plans for increased training, community engagement, and a zero-tolerance policy for misconduct. He didn't shy away from addressing the video that had gone viral. "I know many of you have seen the footage from a few days ago," he said, his voice steady. "Let me be clear, that kind of behavior has no place in this department. We are here to serve and protect, not to demean or humiliate. Accountability starts now." Though he didn't name Hart directly, everyone knew who he was talking about. Derek's words sent a clear message: things were going to be different under his leadership. As the meeting ended, Derek could feel the weight of the department's scrutiny. He knew there would be resistance, pushback, even outright defiance from some. But he also knew there were officers who wanted to see change, who were tired of the old ways and ready for something better. Later that afternoon, Derek received an unexpected call from Hart. The officer's voice was strained, defensive. "Chief Miles," Hart began, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. "I wanted to explain about the other day." Derek listened, his expression unreadable. "Officer Hart," he said finally, "we'll have that conversation in person. For now, focus on reflecting on your actions. I expect professionalism moving forward." As the call ended, Derek leaned back in his chair, his mind already shifting to the next challenge. He had only just begun to scratch the surface of what needed to be done, but he was ready. Change was never easy, but it was always worth fighting for. And Derek Miles wasn't about to back down. The following weeks in Ridgewood were a whirlwind of change, tension, and adjustment. Derek Miles stepped into his role as police chief with a level of resolve that surprised even those who knew him best. He began by holding a series of town hall meetings, inviting residents to share their grievances, concerns, and suggestions for improving the relationship between the police and the community. These gatherings were emotional and raw. Parents spoke about the fear they felt when their teenagers walked home at night. Business owners shared stories of being treated unfairly during routine inspections. Longtime residents recalled decades of mistrust stemming from incidents that had been swept under the rug. Derek listened intently, taking notes and promising to address their concerns. Meanwhile, within the precinct, the atmosphere grew increasingly strained. Officers who had grown accustomed to the old ways of doing things were finding it difficult to adjust to Derek's leadership style. He made it clear that there would be no tolerance for abuse of power or unethical behavior. Policies were rewritten, mandatory bias training was introduced, and the department's internal review board was revamped to ensure greater transparency. For some officers, these changes were a breath of fresh air. Sergeant Maria Lopez, a 10-year veteran of the force, had long been advocating for reforms. She became one of Derek's strongest allies, helping to bridge the gap between the administration and the rank-and-file officers. "We need this," she told her colleagues during a particularly heated discussion in the break room. "If we're going to do our jobs right, we have to earn the trust of the people we serve." Others, however, were less enthusiastic. Jacob Hart, still reeling from his public humiliation, had returned to work under a cloud of resentment. Though he maintained a veneer of professionalism, it was clear to everyone that he was struggling to adjust to the new regime. His reputation had taken a significant hit, and he often found himself on the receiving end of pointed remarks and sidelong glances from his peers. One afternoon, Derek called Hart into his office for a private conversation. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension as Hart took a seat across from Derek's desk. "Officer Hart," Derek began, his tone measured, "I wanted to discuss your role in this department moving forward." Hart shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "With all due respect, Chief, I've been on this force for over a decade. I've put in the time, and I've done the work. I don't think one mistake should define me." Derek regarded him silently for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You're right," he said finally. "One mistake doesn't define a person. But it does reveal something about their character, and how they respond to that mistake says even more." Hart bristled but said nothing, sensing that this was not the time to argue. "I'm giving you a choice," Derek continued. "You can either see this as an opportunity to grow and become the kind of officer this community deserves, or you can remain stuck in the past and let it destroy your career. The decision is yours, but understand this: I will not tolerate behavior that undermines the integrity of this department." For a moment, Hart looked as though he might lash out, but then his shoulders sagged, and he nodded reluctantly. "Understood, Chief." Derek leaned back in his chair, studying the man before him. He wasn't convinced that Hart had fully grasped the gravity of the situation, but he was willing to give him a chance. "Good. Let's move forward." As Hart left the office, Derek felt a flicker of hope. People could change, he believed, but only if they were willing to confront their own flaws. Whether Hart would rise to the challenge remained to be seen. While Derek worked to reform the department from within, the community continued to rally around him. Activists organized neighborhood watch programs, churches held forums on racial reconciliation, and local businesses donated resources to support the police department's new initiatives. Slowly but surely, the walls of mistrust began to crack. One of the most significant turning points came during a community event held at Ridgewood Park. The event, dubbed Bridging the Gap, was designed to foster dialogue and build relationships between the police and the public. Officers participated in activities ranging from pickup basketball games to barbecues, while Derek facilitated open discussions on everything from traffic stops to use of force policies. Hart, reluctantly attending the event, found himself paired with a local pastor in a trust-building exercise. The pastor, a man named Reverend James, was known for his fiery sermons about justice and equality. As the two worked together to complete a series of challenges, Hart began to see the man not as an adversary but as someone who cared deeply about the community. By the end of the day, Hart approached Derek hesitantly. "Chief," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft, "I think I've been looking at this all wrong. Maybe it's time I start listening." Derek raised an eyebrow, surprised but cautiously optimistic. "That's a good start, Hart. Keep it up." As the months passed, Ridgewood began to change in ways that few had thought possible. Complaints of misconduct dropped significantly, and crime rates followed suit. Officers who had once resisted Derek's leadership found themselves embracing the new culture, driven by a sense of pride and purpose. Even Hart, to everyone's astonishment, started to turn a corner. He volunteered for community outreach programs and became an advocate for better training and accountability within the department. Though he still had a long way to go, his efforts did not go unnoticed. Derek, however, remained grounded. He knew that the work was far from over and that the progress they had made was fragile. Change, he often reminded his team, was a journey, not a destination. As he walked through the precinct one evening, greeting officers and staff, he paused to look at the framed photos on the wall, images of past chiefs, each representing a chapter in Ridgewood's history. Derek's own photo would soon join them, but he didn't see it as an endpoint. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter, one that he hoped would inspire others to continue the work of building a better, fairer world. Ridgewood wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like a place where change was not just possible but inevitable. And that, Derek thought, was worth everything. Months turned into a year, and Derek Miles's tenure as Ridgewood's police chief continued to reshape the department and the town itself. His initiatives, community policing, transparency measures, and internal reform, were yielding tangible results. Complaints against the police had dropped by nearly 40%, while engagement with local residents had skyrocketed. Yet, Derek knew that progress often invited resistance, and he was preparing for the challenges that lay ahead. The precinct was bustling on a crisp fall morning when Derek received a call that set the tone for the day. A local news station had obtained an anonymous letter, reportedly written by an officer, alleging misconduct within the department. The letter claimed that some officers were actively undermining Derek's reforms, engaging in covert acts of defiance, and even plotting to leak sensitive information to discredit him. Derek read the report in silence, his expression unreadable. The accusations, if true, weren't entirely unexpected. He had known from the beginning that not everyone would embrace change. But the thought of betrayal within his ranks stung deeply. He called an emergency meeting with his command staff. As the team gathered in the conference room, Derek began with a measured tone. "We have a problem," he said, holding up a printed copy of the news report. "I won't sugarcoat it, this is a serious allegation. If even a fraction of this is true, it threatens everything we've worked for." The room fell silent as his words sank in. Maria Lopez, ever the voice of reason, spoke up. "Chief, do we have any leads on who might have written this? And more importantly, how credible is it?" "We're looking into it," Derek replied. "But the credibility doesn't change the fact that we need to address this head-on. I want a full audit of department communications and operations. If there are officers working against us, we'll find them." The investigation was discreet but thorough. Over the next few weeks, Internal Affairs uncovered a small group of officers who had been quietly resisting Derek's reforms. They called themselves the Old Guard, and their goal was to restore what they saw as the department's true identity. Their tactics ranged from sabotaging community events to leaking minor internal disputes to the press, hoping to paint the administration as chaotic and ineffective. Derek acted swiftly, confronting the group with undeniable evidence of their misconduct. Some officers accepted responsibility, offering apologies and resigning voluntarily. Others doubled down, refusing to admit wrongdoing. Derek made it clear that there would be no room for defiance under his leadership. Those who refused to align with the department's mission were dismissed, their departures sending a clear message to the rest of the force: accountability was non-negotiable. The fallout from the scandal was significant, both internally and in the public eye. Critics of Derek's leadership seized on the controversy, arguing that his reforms had sown division rather than unity. Local newspapers published op-eds questioning whether his vision for the department was sustainable. But Derek remained steadfast. He addressed the community directly at a press conference, standing in front of a backdrop of Ridgewood's emblem. "Change is never easy," he began, his voice resolute. "And when you challenge the status quo, there will always be those who resist. But I want to be clear, the actions of a few do not define this department. We remain committed to serving this community with integrity and fairness. And we will not be deterred." His words resonated with many, but the scandal left lingering doubts among some residents. To rebuild trust, Derek doubled down on transparency. He invited independent oversight committees to review the department's policies and conduct regular audits. He also implemented an anonymous tip line, allowing officers and community members to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. Despite the challenges, there were moments of triumph that reminded Derek why he had taken on this monumental task. One such moment came during a town hall meeting, where a young woman named Tara stood to speak. "I used to avoid the police at all costs," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've lived in Ridgewood my whole life, but I never felt safe around officers, until now. Last week, my little brother got lost on his way home from school. 2 officers found him, stayed with him, and made sure he got home safely. They treated him like he mattered, like we all matter. That wouldn't have happened before Chief Miles took over. So, thank you." The room erupted into applause, and Derek felt a swell of pride. Moments like this reminded him that the work, though grueling, was worth it. Meanwhile, Jacob Hart's transformation was one of the most surprising developments. Once a staunch critic of Derek's leadership, Hart had become one of the department's most vocal advocates for change. He volunteered for every community outreach event, mentored new recruits, and even led a workshop on cultural sensitivity. One day, Hart approached Derek in the precinct's hallway. "Chief," he said, his tone earnest, "I just wanted to say, I was wrong about you. About all of this. I've learned a lot in the past year, and I'm proud to be part of this team now." Derek nodded, his expression softening. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, Hart. I'm glad to have you on board." As the anniversary of Derek's appointment approached, the town of Ridgewood held a celebration to honor the progress that had been made. The event was held in the same park where the Bridging the Gap initiative had taken place. Residents, officers, and city officials gathered to reflect on the journey and look ahead to the future. Derek took the stage to address the crowd, his voice filled with emotion. "This past year has been one of the most challenging and rewarding experiences of my life. We've faced obstacles, setbacks, and resistance, but we've also seen growth, unity, and hope. This is just the beginning. Together, we can continue to build a Ridgewood that we're all proud to call home." As the crowd erupted into cheers, Derek felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond personal accomplishment. This wasn't about him, it was about the people, the community, and the belief that even the most entrenched systems could be transformed with courage, perseverance, and a commitment to justice. The night ended with a candlelit vigil, symbolizing the light of hope that had been reignited in Ridgewood. As Derek stood among the glowing candles, he knew the journey was far from over. But he was ready for whatever came next, armed with the support of a community that believed in the power of change. The dawn of a new year brought a renewed sense of purpose to Ridgewood. Derek Miles, now firmly established as the town's police chief, had begun to see the fruits of his labor materialize in ways that went beyond statistics and headlines. The community's atmosphere had shifted, where there had once been a pervasive sense of tension and mistrust, there was now cautious optimism and growing collaboration. But for Derek, the road ahead remained one of vigilance. Change, he knew, was fragile. The challenges began to evolve, becoming more nuanced than the overt resistance he had initially faced. As his reforms settled into place, Derek noticed new dynamics emerging within the department. Younger recruits, inspired by the changes, eagerly embraced the new policies, seeing them as a pathway to meaningful service. Older officers, even those who had initially resisted, began to soften their stances as they witnessed the tangible improvements in community relations. However, a subtle undercurrent of skepticism lingered, particularly among those who had grown comfortable in their ways but had not outright opposed the changes. One morning, Derek received a call from Mayor Hendricks, requesting an urgent meeting. When Derek arrived at City Hall, the mayor's expression was grim. "Chief Miles," Hendricks began, gesturing for him to sit, "we've got a new situation brewing. The state is launching an investigation into police departments across the region, focusing on past misconduct and unresolved complaints. Ridgewood is on that list." Derek nodded, unsurprised. "What's their scope?" "Everything," Hendricks replied. "Use of force cases, racial profiling allegations, internal misconduct. If it happened in the last 2 decades, they're looking into it. And while I trust the work you've done, this is going to dredge up a lot of old wounds." Derek took a deep breath. He knew the investigation could be both a challenge and an opportunity. "Let them come," he said firmly. "If there's anything left to uncover, we'll face it head-on. Transparency has been our commitment from day one, and we won't back down now." When news of the investigation broke, it reignited heated discussions throughout the community. Some residents were supportive, viewing the inquiry as a necessary step toward justice and accountability. Others were apprehensive, fearing that old scandals could overshadow the progress that had been made. Derek held another town hall meeting, addressing the issue directly. "We cannot build a better future by ignoring the past," he told the packed room. "If there are unresolved cases or unanswered questions, they deserve to see the light of day. This investigation isn't a threat, it's an opportunity to prove that we're committed to doing things the right way." The weeks that followed were intense. State investigators combed through mountains of records, interviewed officers and residents, and scrutinized policies and practices from years gone by. Derek worked closely with the investigators, offering full cooperation while also ensuring that his department maintained its day-to-day responsibilities. During this time, Derek found himself reflecting on his own journey. Late one night, as he sat in his office reviewing files, he came across the personnel record of Jacob Hart. The name brought a wave of memories, the heated confrontation, the moment of reckoning, and the surprising transformation. Hart had become a symbol of the department's potential for change, but his journey also highlighted the complexities of leadership and redemption. The investigation brought to light several cases that had been mishandled or ignored by previous administrations. Derek and his team faced the difficult task of addressing these issues head-on, reaching out to the families and individuals affected, and taking steps to rectify past wrongs. This process was emotionally draining but ultimately necessary. One such case involved a young man named Kevin Ortiz, who had been falsely accused of theft years earlier. The investigation revealed that the evidence against him had been fabricated by a now-retired officer. Derek personally met with Kevin and his family to offer an apology on behalf of the department. "I can't change what happened to you," Derek said, his voice heavy with sincerity. "But I promise you, we're doing everything we can to ensure this never happens again." Kevin's mother, tears streaming down her face, nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. "It means more than you know." Stories like Kevin's became a rallying cry for Derek's team, reminding them why the work they were doing mattered. The investigation, while painful, became a catalyst for deeper reforms. Policies were updated, historical cases were reviewed, and new mechanisms were put in place to prevent similar injustices in the future. As the state's findings were published, Ridgewood's police department was praised for its cooperation and the significant strides it had made under Derek's leadership. While the report highlighted past failures, it also acknowledged the transformative efforts that had begun to rebuild trust and accountability. Derek's unwavering commitment inspired other towns to reach out for guidance. He began receiving invitations to speak at conferences, sharing Ridgewood's story and offering insights into the challenges and rewards of systemic reform. One such speaking engagement took Derek to a neighboring city where he met Chief Elaine Parker, a trailblazing leader in her own right. The two bonded over their shared experiences and quickly developed a professional partnership. Together, they launched a regional initiative aimed at fostering collaboration and resource sharing among police departments committed to reform. Back in Ridgewood, the changes continued to ripple outward. Community programs flourished, schools partnered with the police department to create mentorship opportunities, and residents began to take pride in their town's progress. One evening, Derek found himself walking through the neighborhood where his journey as chief had begun, the very street where he had first encountered Jacob Hart. He paused in front of the diner where the confrontation had occurred, reflecting on how much had changed since that fateful day. As he stood there, a young boy approached him, holding out a notebook and a pen. "Are you Chief Miles?" the boy asked, wide-eyed. "I am," Derek replied with a smile. "My mom says you're a hero," the boy said. "Can I have your autograph?" Derek chuckled, humbled by the moment. He signed the notebook, adding a message, "Never stop believing in change." As the boy ran off, Derek felt a deep sense of fulfillment. His work was far from done. There would always be new challenges to face, new battles to fight. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Ridgewood was no longer a town defined by division and mistrust. It had become a place where change was not just a possibility but a reality. And Derek Miles was proud to be a part of that journey.